semiconductor meeting yesterday with Kishida and the likes of TSMC. Micron, of course, there's this deal of $1.5 billion to bring advanced chip-making equipment to Japan. We know Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing is building a big plant down in Kumamoto in Kyushu. How significant is this? Kind of a re-energizing Japan's tech base by sort of de-risking the supply chain issues that are associated with being located in Taiwan?
I think it's very significant. Back in the 1980s and 90s, when I was in the U.S. government, we were involved in negotiations with Japan on semiconductors because at that time, the U.S. and Japan were the leading semiconductor producers. But now, with the rise of Taiwan, South Korea, and China, the fact that Japan and the United States are cooperating along with Taiwan and South Korea is very significant. And I think that Japan is eager to have more foreign direct investment in Japan and to be a greater center for high technology, including especially advanced semiconductors. So I do think this attempt by Japan to bring in the semiconductor industry from around the world is quite significant in terms of not only the economy, but also in terms of strengthening economic security.
Well, of course, on the one hand is that economic security and securing supply chain. What's it going to mean for the Japanese economy? There's been a bit of a wave, if you will, of sentiment towards Japan. Inflation, as we just got CPI numbers, is creeping up. You have that weaker yen. Do you see a real turnaround after a couple of decades of deflation and stagnation in Japan, that Japan is turning the corner a bit?
Well, yes, I think the environment in Asia is such that Japan is now the most stable economy and the most stable political system among the G7 countries. And with a weak yen, Japan is increasingly attractive as a place to invest. And I think the Japanese are very eager, especially because of the demographics in Japan, the need to have more innovation, more startups, more technology. Those are all things that the Japanese think are very, very important. So I think there's a good meshing of the interests of other countries with wanting to reduce risk with China, for instance. At the same time, Japan becoming more attractive. So I do think the potential for Japan to benefit from this environment is pretty significant.
Glenn Fukushima, good to have you with us. Senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. And of course, our chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, joining us from Hiroshima at the G7 summit. Catch our conversation with U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, on Bloomberg Markets China Open, also coming up live from Hiroshima. Let's get to Vonnie Quinn here in New York with the first word headlines. Vonnie.
Sherry, thank you. Fed officials are sounding increasingly split over whether to raise or pause interest rate increases at their next meeting. While Governor Philip Jefferson made the case for patience, Dallas Fed Chief Lori Logan suggested she's not ready to pause tightening. She floated the idea of skipping action next month, only to return to it at their meeting in July. The Philippine Central Bank will probably keep rates unchanged in their next 2 to 3 meetings in a move the governor calls a prudent pause. Felipe Medalla says it will allow time to assess the impact of the BSB's most aggressive monetary tightening in decades. The central bank on Thursday held the key rate at 6.25% after inflation cooled for a third month and economic growth softened. The top U.S. bank regulators are vowing to act quickly on long-delayed rules to clamp down on executive pay and bonuses. The move comes after former executives at failed lenders at Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank faced criticism from lawmakers over their generous compensation. The rules were mandated by the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act to discourage executives from taking risks that led to the 2008 meltdown. Global News, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Vonnie Quinn, and this is Bloomberg. Heidi.
Coming up next, we take a closer look at the lasting health impact of wildfire smoke on people here in Australia and the legacy that it's leaving for the next generation. This is Bloomberg. Australia's worst fire season on record is pointing to grim health impacts for the next generation. That's the subject of Bloomberg's latest Big Take, which takes a look at the toxic legacy of wildfires or bushfires here, leaving children gasping for air years later. Let's discuss this in more detail with our global business reporter Angus Whitley in Sydney. And we all went through this, right? We bought air purifiers at the time because the air quality was so bad, but this has become a longer term issue.
That's right, Heidi. We wanted to see what the longer term fallout was, especially for kids who were either, in gestation at the time, 3 years ago, or were in the early months of their lives. And we wanted to see, we knew what the immediate impact was of those terrible fires 3 years ago when 80% of the Australian population was affected by smoke to some degree. But we wondered, what does that do to the human body, especially to kids, in the longer term? And over several months, a colleague and I interviewed mums and families with small children or mums who were pregnant at the time. And it's clear that there are ongoing troubles that these kids are facing, some with respiratory diseases, taking breathing medication day and night, others with more troubling cognitive issues, others with physical challenges like balance, speech, fine motor skills. And it's clear there's a hole in the research. We don't know what the impact will be from wildfire smoke, and that's the big question that researchers are racing to answer at the moment.
Angus, we know that the financial burden on these households, as well as for the entire country, has been huge. Tell us about that as well.
It's clearly not just a physical toll on families. The economic toll is climbing. Some estimates put the economic cost at $36 billion. That's just a figure for the US, incidentally, $36 billion a year. And if you extrapolate that into the future, that's a figure that's going to only climb and also take its toll on productivity and economic output. There are other figures that are forecasting some 2,500 deaths in Australia this decade at a cost of 17 billion Australian dollars. So it's clearly an economic toll and an emotional and a physical toll as well.
Is the government doing anything to mitigate the pain here, whether it's on the financial side of things or for the years ahead, so this doesn't happen again?
This is a key question. I think when you look at the outlook for wildfires around the world, just this week, the United Nations said we're likely to have a record hot year at some point before 2027. And we know that meteorologists the world over are forecasting more intense wildfires more frequently with more destruction. So it's a question that not just Australian authorities face, but governments in obviously fire-prone areas like California, like the Mediterranean, but also in other areas that perhaps aren't used to wildfires in recent years. And we've seen areas of the Arctic touched by wildfires, Alaska, Greenland, Canada in recent years. So it's a question for government to say, well, how can we mitigate the effects of it, but also how can we prevent them happening in the first place? And then it comes down to practical measures like air filters, like safe refuges for communities, with masks, with proper